y'all? It is episode 9 of The Rising Tide. I'm one of your hosts, Dayton the Boys, sitting with my co-host,
Dale Smith.
What's up, y'all? So, we got an interesting episode for y'all today. We're going to be talking about how much we love boosters. We're going to talk about the California billionaires tax, the recent war in Iran, resistance against the World Cup that has come to America, and Elon Musk becoming the world's first trillionaire. So we got all kinds of bullshit. Just kidding. All kinds of really important stuff to talk about and discuss. So I don't know, Dale, you want to get us started talking about this boosters thing? I ran into you at the Castro Theater yesterday. We didn't plan that.
Yeah, we both happened to be there with our girlfriends. It was a cool screening.
Don't tell them it was a girlfriend. I have to leave myself queer-coded.
Hey, man, my girlfriend's queer, and she
that doesn't work.
Me, so
it's obnoxious.
whatever,
It's an obnoxious thing to do, and we accept it. I'm sorry. Keep going.
All right. Yeah, so we both happened to be at this screening of Boots Riley's newest movie, I Love Boosters, which was at the Castro Theater. It was interesting, too, because at the end of it, we saw there was an interview, or there was like a Q&A session between Boots Riley and, last black man.
Joe Talbot.
Joe Talbot, yeah. So the guy that directed and produced The Last Black Man in San Francisco.
Who is white, which is news to me.
Yeah, and people, I feel like, often associate Jimmy Fails with the movie.
Fails, okay.
Yeah, he was the one that wrote the story and was probably, involved in many aspects of the film. But Joe Talbot, who's the son of David Talbot, was the one that directed that movie, and I didn't realize that he was going to be the one conducting the Q&A session afterwards, which left me kind of upset because, as those of you who stay tuned to our weekly news updates, I talked a little bit about how he directed the Comeback City San Francisco short, which is, seems pretty obviously funded by a lot of these billionaires from the Democrat and Republican party. So that left me feeling a little miffed.
Yeah, absolutely.
But, I thought the movie itself was enjoyable. I thought it was a good outing from Boots Riley. The cinematography was great. The soundtrack was great. The costumes were exceptional. It's got to win, or at least be nominated for some awards for that in particular. And I thought it was interesting, especially how he was, it's sort of like is a mix between like him kind of like giving like a sort of satirical, surrealist, Looney Tunes-esque like take on booster culture in the Bay Area. It's like a critique of capitalism, but then him also trying to explain dialectical materialism and the class struggle to people. So I thought that was interesting, a way of going about that. Trying to give it a more palatable, presentable format for people to better understand this stuff. I also thought it was great, too, that in this movie compared to his last movie, it seemed like he was kind of making fun of like the union organizer in that one. But in this one, the union organizer, not to spoil too much, is really the one that's like laying it down, like what dialectical materialism is. They're leading the class struggle in some respects, and they play a pretty pivotal role in the movie itself. Overall, I thought it was pretty enjoyable. It unfortunately, because of how the sound was mixed, it's mixed for a regular theater. The Castro Theater has since been converted into a concert space, so it was probably just like flattened very simply into 2.1.
I couldn't hear a thing that Lakeith Stanfield said.
It was fucked up. Yeah, the mixing was
single thing that brother was saying.
Even though I was sitting like center of the theater. I might see it again. I would definitely watch it again at home. Definitely recommend people checking it out if they haven't seen it yet. But yeah, I'd be curious to hear just what your take on the movie was.
Well, I agree that it's very enjoyable. I think with Boots Riley, the basic kind of premise, the way he injects politics, is this idea that it has to be as absurd as possible, right? Like, if you're familiar with like Sorry to Bother You, the idea is that like the bourgeoisie wants to literally turn everybody into horse people, right?
Yeah,
that's
spoilers,
the metaphor.
Spoilers.
It's been out for almost 10 years. That's fine. It's like an 8-year-old film, right? And so, like, those similar approaches taken in this film, which is fun. It's fun. way to approach it versus just like some educational piece, right? You know, I always
Mm-hmm.
think back to some of the the revolutionary films of like the '60s and the '30s, right? You think like Salt of the Earth, you think Finally Got the
Great
News,
movie.
you know, two
Great
very
movie.
like
Great
direct
documentary.
films, like just dealing directly
Mm-hmm.
with the politics in plain language, right? And so obviously, you know, in this modern media landscape where it's so predominated by these capitalist interests, it's very difficult just to make a straight up red film and have that be
Mm-hmm.
produced, right? And it's also less fun. It's less fun. We should find a creative way to express
Mm-hmm.
these ideas. You know, I think one of the interesting topics that was covered in the film is loneliness, right? Because the
Mm-hmm.
protagonist, she's given like two routes to like end her loneliness, you know, romance or international solidarity, right? And so I
Mm-hmm.
thought that was interesting, you know. And I keep looking at my notes on my phone because right before went to this film, I got bipped myself, which is
Rip.
ironic. I just go into Oakland, park on MacArthur, and then someone opens up my trunk, takes my laptop out of my backpack, leaves the backpack, which actually was very nice of them. That was a very
Sometimes they're a
kind
little considerate.
very kind thing for them to do, because if they had really taken my backpack too, that would have been very demoralizing, you
Yeah.
know. But I think it goes back to this whole like real culture of, I don't want to say the culture of bipping, because that even like is ridiculous, right? Like crime is like I don't want to say like there's a it really puts the onus on the people, right? Like, why
Yeah.
do people commit crimes? Like, oh, well, it's their culture. They just like to steal, right? And I think, sorry to
Mm-hmm.
bother you. I'm not sorry to bother you. Oh my goodness. But I Love Boosters really tries to confront this like larger socioeconomic reality of why people turn to this boosting, and why
Mm-hmm.
the people that oppose the boosters, like at the systemic level, like from the idea of media, culture, and politics, like, well, it's not really has anything to do with public safety. It's everything to do with advancing their own class interests and
Mm-hmm.
keeping working people down.
Yeah, that's well said. And I think it had some great insights into how it's like, oh, well, it's saying the real criminals are like the people out on the street boosting clothes, but really it's like who's stealing their ideas. You know, these people
Mm-hmm.
are bigger than just, these labels that are put on them, who's promoting these narratives through the media. I thought it was interesting too, in the Q&A session afterwards when, Boots was being asked by Talbot, like, he's like, oh, what do you think about this whole like bipping culture and stuff? It's like, well, the Intercept put out a pretty good article recently about like how a lot of this stuff comes from, right wing think tanks that are funded by police, like the POA and stuff, Police Officer Association, to really promote this idea that crime is on the rise. It's affecting everybody. It's terrible. And this, somewhat ironically, feeds into this narrative that people like Talbot help craft by doing
Mm-hmm.
this stuff. The guy made one movie. It was probably like 8 years ago at this point. Hasn't really done anything since.
With a very negative political message. Like, let's be frank. Like, the whole point of Last Black Man in San Francisco is there's nothing you can do, so just move.
It's pretty nihilistic. There's some
Yeah,
good moments in
yeah,
it,
yeah,
but
yeah.
I don't know. People have mixed, different feelings about it. But I think it's important to recognize, even somebody who's like trying to portray themselves as like, oh, I'm like from this city, I love this place, this and that. It's like, yeah, but who are you getting bankrolled by to push
Yeah.
specific messages? I don't think Boots like picked him out personally to ask him questions and stuff. And I thought it was pretty revealing, like, his response to that. And it was cool just hearing Boots talk in general, even if the whole time I was like sneering at Talbot asking questions and just thinking like, man, if I really could ask somebody a question, I would just ask him directly, like, who'd you get money from to do this thing?
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
but movie overall definitely worth seeing. Highly recommend it. Seeing it in like a more traditional movie theater, unfortunately, as opposed to like one of the more classic ones, where it might not be mixed properly as we experienced. But I definitely think there is a huge need for this type of media, this type of medium, these types of films to be put out, that maybe aren't like fully revolutionary, but have that essence in it. And I think that's important because oftentimes we see how popular mainstream media gets, skewed and like portrayed as like being this revolutionary thing when really it plays the opposite role. Like obviously the big one that always comes to mind for me is like with Black Panther and stuff. When in reality, like Wakanda was this like isolationist, entity that was working with the CIA and wanted no business in actually Black liberation and stuff. So, but I think like, yeah, this movie was great. Highly recommend it. Definitely worth checking out.
Yeah, it's worth checking out. Finding a theater near you. Yeah.
Right on. So yeah, let's move on to the next part about the statewide potential billionaire tax.
Yes, the billionaire tax. I think in San Francisco, folks have been paying attention. This, we've. I always just want to open this up by just using the example of the San Francisco wealth tax. We had Proposition C, which was on the ballot. I think this was 2018.
Sounds
Right.
right.
Yeah, about there. So almost 8 years ago at this point, right? Where I think it was a tax on profits over $50 million, which which targets normally very large corporations. We're not talking about mom and pop shops,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think this is just a micro example of how I really see a lot of these ballot measures taxing the wealthy, these institutional reform-minded attempts to redistribute wealth play out in the sense that they just don't work. Right, because I think with Proposition C, I think when it was initially passed, I think overwhelmingly passed in San Francisco, with I think over 80% approval from the voters. Look this up; it's true. And then it was immediately just like tied up in the courts for 4 years almost before ultimately the wealth that was achieved, that was taken from that wealth tax was just sent to SFPD, right? It was just a pot of money just sent to get more cops, right? And so that wealth tax in San Francisco created the basis for the explosion in the police industrial complex that we've seen in the last 8 years. So it's like, the people demand change, and we see how this bourgeois system uses that drive to actually just even reinforce its own interests. And I think, it's really just important that we understand that, particularly now when the money in politics is so high, right? Where all these candidates, in order to be any type of candidate outside of, city controller, you have to have so much corporate backing
Mm-hmm.
to where, the voters stop mattering, right? Because they're just buying signatures to put people on the ballot. They're flooding the news waves with all their candidate ads, right? They're flooding your phone and your telephone with all these different ads as well. And more grassroots candidates can't even make the ballot. And so no matter what you vote for, ultimately, it's just the same basic corporate interest. And I think, this money in politics is at such like a tipping point in our society now, where guys like Dan Laurie could literally just shoot a homeless guy in the middle of the street, and then it wouldn't even make the news and make an impact on his next mayoral race. And so, I think, and I think it's this aspect of like the money in politics is so important. You think of last year where there was on the ballot, there was the ban on slave labor in California prisons, which
Mm-hmm.
did not pass, right? And then what did that do to the media landscape? Then, the conservatives, they come out and say, wow, see, the average American actually is actually against major police reform. They actually don't have a problem with prisons using slave labor. Well, it's deeper than that. It's like in a bourgeois society, like our basic democratic system becomes a dollar per vote system, right? So whoever is able to spend the most money is ultimately the one who's able to win the most elections. And so, I can imagine. I don't even have to look up these surveys to know that the average electorate is in favor of taxing billionaires, right? Like that is so clearly is, and the demographic data does back that up. Like I'm not just talking out my ass here, but it is unlikely to pass. And if it does pass, right, it's immediately going to be attacked by the legal system, right? Like immediately,
Mm-hmm.
all these billionaires are going to use every aspect of the legal system, which they're very good at using, to obstruct it every step of the way. And like we've seen in San Francisco, if they manage to collect the money, they're going to find some way to steal it back through the form of public subsidies, through sending money to cops, And so, yeah, I think that's the basics of it, right? Of this situation that, like,
Mm-hmm.
like I think the fact it's on the ballot, I think is a basic response to like where the needle is, where people are so incensed about the money in politics. They're so incensed about wealth disparity that if you want to be any kind of progressive, you have to at least pretend that you care about this basic idea of redistribution of wealth. But in our present capitalist system, we can't use the legal system to redistribute wealth.
Yeah, I mean, I think you raised some pretty important points. I think like um, some people might point to in this most recent election, it's like, oh, but like Tom Steyer and like Shoykat Chakrabarty spent tons of money, more than the other candidates, and they weren't able to actually win their elections. But I think part of it has to do with like the messaging they're putting forward and their ties to the establishment as well. And I think like ultimately the establishment is always looking ways to funnel people back into what already exists,
Exactly.
And yeah, I think essentially like most people are in favor of these types of taxes. I know we are. If it were to pass, that would be a positive thing. But at the same time, a lot of these people control many aspects of the media. A lot of these people have these extremely high-powered lawyers that they can just keep throwing money at. And these people want this to fail. I mean, I think this past week, the SF Standard came out with an article talking about how a lot of these people who are opposing this, the statewide tax, they're trying to work together in some respects. There was like a signal chat that was uncovered by, this journalist that basically found that the head of Google, venture capitalists, the CEO of Zynga, people in finance, Gary Tan, the guy that's behind GrowSF and stuff, PayPal co-founder, et cetera, all these people were trying to find a way to coordinate to defeat this on a statewide level. But at the same time, they're divided in exactly how to do that. This article that I read is specifically talking about how Ron Conway, who's like the guy for SF politics, who bankrolled every mayor up until Lurie, from Willie Brown to Lurie, he was like, he's been around the block a few times, and he was like disagreeing with a lot of these people as to how to go about doing this. And it's kind of funny because he didn't end up getting added to later chats down the road because of these disagreements. So, there are fractures even within the ruling class and how they're deciding to go about fighting back against this. But at the end of the day, they're all united in their goal, just not in how they're going about doing this, And I think, ultimately, like what it's going to take for something like this to be effective is to really like expose these fractures and capitalize on them, but to actually like have some sort of movement that isn't specifically along the lines of like playing their game, because we've already seen how this plays out at a local level. It's a complete shit show. If we're to just expand that to a statewide, even like a nationwide level, it's going to be the same thing, only bigger, And the only way that it's going to work is, part of it does have to come through going through some of these legal avenues, trying to challenge it in court and stuff, but also using that as a way to move the movement forward instead of just like, resting on your laurels and like hoping that for some reason the judge that's presiding over this case is like going to rule in your favor. At the end of the day, like anything that ends up getting voted on is going to end up in front of a bunch of politicians, and they're just going to decide whether or not they agree with it or not. It doesn't matter how it goes at the ballot box. I mean, I bring this example up time and time again. I want to say it was like 2017 or it might have been the 2016 election. There was like a proposition locally where it was like talking about, actually putting the responsibility of taking care of the trees in San Francisco back on the city. Initially the city was like, we want people to plant trees, but then they're like, it's too expensive. If you have a tree in front of your house, it's your responsibility. And then this ballot proposition came forward. It said like, actually, no, you were promoting this before. This is for safety and all sorts of stuff. You have to take care of these trees. And despite the fact that it passed, it still ended up in front of the supervisors and like, what are we going to do? Do we want to do this or do we not? And that's something as simple as fucking trees. If we're talking about a tax against billionaires, a tax against the richest people in the state, in this country, in the world in some cases, it's not even going to be that simple, So I think we're going to see how this ramps up over the next few months, the different pro and against campaigns that are waged against this particular proposition. I'm hopeful it does pass, but I think we also have to be realistic about like what that means if it does pass, what it means if it doesn't, and what has to happen in order for it to actually be enacted. And it's not just as simple as like, everybody checking the box to say yes and then being like, all right, we did the thing,
Absolutely. And of course you can hear like, you already know what the counter arguments against taxing the rich are going to be, right? This idea that the billionaires are the ones who create this robust economy, and if we tax them, they're just going to leave and go out of state, which is ridiculous because even if they did do that, their business interests still are here. They're still based in the states. This idea that we have to allow people to exploit the entire system, and if we try to hold them accountable in some way, it's going to ruin the whole economy. It's just like the smooth brain take that goes for like political discourse in this society. There's so much money in politics.
It happens from coast to coast, from
Mm-hmm.
election to election. It happened the same exact rhetoric that is being employed with this was the same exact rhetoric that was being employed against Mamdani in New York, and it's the same exact rhetoric that's being employed in every other election where wealth inequality is on the table front and center. These billionaires, these people who have these interests are always going to put this same talking point out there, and most of the time they're not going to do anything about it. They're not going to actually leave where they have their headquarters and all this sort of stuff. In some cases they might, but there's not going to be this mass exodus because we see this narrative coming up time and time again, and we don't see it happening. So this isn't changing so much from
Nothing.
year to year. So
Nothing.
yeah.
All right. So, do you want to move on to the Strait of Hormuz, or do you want to go on to the World Cup?
Let's talk about the World Cup a little bit.
Perfect.
Yeah, just because, I think, I mentioned this as well last week in the weekly news update. There's a lot of fanfare around the World Cup being in the United States. Arguably the most, if not one of the most corrupt international sports organizations in the world. This is an organization, FIFA, that literally made a brand new peace prize just to give to the president after he tried to steal a championship trophy, and I think he did so successfully.
Trump did?
Yeah,
Hell yeah.
last year was fucking
America
ridiculous.
first.
Yeah, he literally went on stage with I forget exactly what the tournament was, but he literally went on stage with the winners and took the trophy for himself.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, that says so much. But
Uh,
regardless, people love soccer, people love the World Cup. And especially here in the United States, people have a tendency to turn the other cheek towards what's really happening under the surface. But despite that, there still has been resistance to the World Cup in the Bay Area, in California, across, both the United States and Mexico. And so there's been protests at different sites where the whole World Cup is being held. Last Saturday, there was a coalition effort in Santa Clara where a number of protesters from different organizations like the International League of People Struggles and Black Alliance for Peace and Code Pink and such came to, put forward some opposition against the tournament itself. Unfortunately, based on what I've seen online, it did seem like, the opposition to the World Cup itself compared to the amount of people that were just coming out for the World Cup, it was relatively small, But I think that's the reality of the situation, especially when we're talking about entertainment, when we're talking about sports in the United States. Fortunately, we're going to have the opportunity to talk to somebody who was there, and we'll have that for you in this episode and also online. Just to hear their take about what they're thinking about organizing this, why this is important, why we can't just look the other way when this sort of stuff happens.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today, Bernie. You got a chance to see some of the interview questions, so I guess I just wanted to ask if you want to just introduce yourself for our audience.
Yeah, hello, I'm Bernie with Black Alliance for Peace Bay Area chapter. Black Alliance for Peace is a organization that is for the international liberation of Black people on the continent and in the diaspora.
Say that again. Just kidding. I heard. Awesome. Thank you so much. That's such a succinct explanation of what BAP is, and we can get more into that. But I think the first question is, we're here just talking a little about this World Cup that's taken the nation by storm. All these European internationals flooding into our shores for some football. So I guess my first question, because at this point in this episode we're talking about some of the resistance to the World Cup. So the real question is, why would anyone protest the World Cup?
Yeah, So the World Cup is the largest sporting event on the planet. And obviously people love football. We call it soccer in the States, but it's football. And um we are calling for a boycott of the World Cup because there are just so many examples of the United States and its allies committing crimes against humanity, genocide, both on um, on its own shores, like with ICE and the disappearances of everyday people into facilities that don't have adequate food, adequate shelter, and the atrocities that the U.S. is funding and giving diplomatic cover for abroad, um, especially the genocide in Palestine, in addition to ethnic cleansing. Now that's been spread to Lebanon, the unnecessary illegal war in Iran. Um, where do I even start? Cuba. We're starving Cuba. We have a decades-long oil embargo that's starving people, that children are not able to um, eat, not able to have proper nutrition because of the blockade. I can go on, but basically, we are saying that in order to be compliant and align with FIFA's proposed um, values, it should not be held in the United States,
Mhm.
or the game should not be held in the United States.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's so important that you put it all out there in that succinct way, right? Because sports culture is such, it's such a popular thing, right? Here in the States, internationally. But I think it's just really important that people really understand that these international games are themselves indicative of inter-imperialist competition, right?
Mhm.
Like the fact where the games are held, how the teams are treated. It's all just
Mhm.
indicative of these patterns, right? In the full episode, we're talking a little bit more about how, the Iranian team was allowed into the US to play one game and then they're immediately kicked out.
That they had
Right.
to go back to Tijuana, I think.
Immediately. Yeah, their
Yeah.
base camp in
And
Mexico City.
that's like an unfair, that's a disadvantage, intentionally so. Um, the players had nothing to do with Trump's illegal war in Iran, and they are being punished. And that is just an indictment on FIFA, on the US, and on the international community as a whole for excusing this behavior.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think overall we can really just see how, these, larger systems, they impact everything, obviously even the culture we get to enjoy. And I always feel that, the sports culture, and as we see it as this corporate entity, it's very much just like a tool of dividing the working class, right? Like
Mhm.
dividing them literally nationally, dividing them statewide, dividing them by cities, dividing them literally by colors. Folks who from urban areas know exactly what I'm talking about. So I guess like, there was a demonstration last week at some of the games over in the peninsula. And so I'm just curious, getting your perspective as someone who was there, engaged and helped organize those protests. I just maybe if you could talk a little bit about what actually took place with some of these demonstrations.
Yeah, so we demonstrated outside of Levi Stadium in Santa Clara, and that consisted of several speeches. We handed out informational pamphlets about Black Alliance for Peace and what we're involved in, also about BDS and how people can get involved in that boycott, divest, sanctions. And yeah, it was mainly well, two things. It was an opportunity for all of the coalitions that were involved in organizing this demonstration to see each other face to face. Because I haven't been organizing for long. This is probably like, I'm going to say like my third month. And I already see that I'm like getting very close to people that I see on Zoom. And like, that was the first time I actually saw them face to face. And it was just a great chance to see that like we, people who care about other human beings, are not alone in the fight for collective human liberation. Um, in addition to um, in addition to it being a chance for coalition building, it was also an educational opportunity for people who might not necessarily know what kind of atrocities FIFA is promoting by having the games here. So unfortunately, we didn't have a lot of time to interact with the fans that were coming on because we weren't able to be as close to the stadium as we would have liked. But the fans or the people that did come, um, like just crossing the street or like coming towards the stadium, they were curious about what we were doing, and that was a chance for us to explain why we're there, what FIFA is doing, and just giving like a little glimpse into the myriad of reasons why the game should not be hosted here.
Yeah, it's good to hear that there's some attempt to interact with the fans, because I think, we're not just trying to raise noise, right? Sort of like what you're
Mhm.
talking about of getting to better meet these people that we've only been connected with online. We get to go IRL, so to speak, and engage with each other as comrades and then actually go amongst the people. And so I guess my next question is, are there plans to continue demonstrating or raising awareness by BAP?
We do have some plans. Those are currently in the works right now. And when they are more solidified, we encourage people to go to blackallianceforpeace.com to see what other events we will be holding. But those will probably be more focused on the watch parties that are going on and just disseminating information and really engaging with the fans, asking them how much do they know about what the US is involved in, about how FIFA is allowing players from different countries to be treated. Like, do you know that like four out of the however many countries that are playing do not allow their fans to come to the United States because of visa bans and
Mm.
how unfair that is.
Mhm.
So yeah, just kind of getting a temperature check on where people are in terms of their knowledge and just giving them more knowledge because the what am I trying to say? I guess like this is a common saying, but the first step to revolution is knowledge or
Mhm.
is education. And what we want to do is really give that education in a way that is palatable to people who might not be aware of what is going on.
Yeah, I think it's important you raise that issue of the visa bans, right? Because have this idea that all these different teams or these national governments participating in visa, but aren't necessarily able to take this firm stance against the current Trump administration that wouldn't let these people emigrate normally. Oh
Hmm.
my goodness, right? So allow the national teams, but not any of the nationalities.
Hmm.
Right, such an interesting contradiction. But it also goes back to the fact that so many of these corporate entities, some of these different national governments themselves don't take a firm stance against the U.S. imperialists. And so I guess that leads me to my next question. And so my questions, obviously it's a more question geared toward the organization. You don't feel free to, represent yourself. We don't have to give a whole thing about the national organization of BAP things. But I guess the question is, how does BAP see these protests as advancing the anti-imperialist movement?
So I will speak for myself. I'll let the organizers from BAP speak
Of course.
on that behalf. But um, I think it's about connecting the dots,
Mhm.
really connecting the dots between what is happening at home, why you can't afford childcare, why you can't afford health care, and the atrocities that we are funding with our tax dollars abroad.
Mhm.
A lot of the times, people just don't really make those connections and they think that domestic politics is totally separate from international politics, but they are one and the same.
Mhm.
The same entities that are responsible for the subjugation of Black and Brown people here are the same ones who are promoting the ethnic cleansing and genocide of um, of people in Gaza, of people in Palestine. And I can go through the whole list of where else the US is involved in, like AFRICOM in Africa, how the US is involved in the bombing of Nigeria, just the rampant militarism of the United States is not separate from the militarism that we see here amongst our own population, especially with ICE. That what we see with ICE is the chickens coming home to roost, so to say.
Absolutely. And then, I think it's so interesting that it's framed in that way because, I think in particular what we've seen over the last 3 years, particularly around the war in Palestine, the genocide on Palestine more accurately, is really just this attempt to really kind of silo these international issues, right, for the domestic audience. Particularly here in the United States, you think of these things with different election candidates, right? There's always the assessment of, Kamala Harris back in the news, right? Of what do black people care about? Do we care about representation or do we care about anti-imperialism? Are these really separate things as they're presented in the media, right? And I think oftentimes that's how it's presented to black people, right? Like as black people, we have to worry about black people's issues. And once we worry
Mm,
about black people's issues, then we can get a little more comfortable. Then we can worry about that international stuff, right? Really as if these are distractions, right? And so I guess that's to the final question. It's like, how do you really think this relates to the black diaspora and the workers' movement? Because it's presented separately.
mhm. It's not separate. Like you were saying, how Black people here, they, of course, need to be concerned with the issues that are plaguing us in our communities. Rampant police brutality, our incarceration rates are unlike anywhere else in the world, poverty. I can go on, but those things are all connected. And what we want to do is make those connections so that Black people, especially, know that we are part of an international community. What affects Black people in Nigeria or Senegal um, directly affects us here as well.
Especially with the same drones dropping bombs or surveilling our
Mhm.
communities, right? Mhm.
Surveillance is a really good one. Surveillance in using AI in Palestine, those are the same surveillance tactics that are being used in our communities here.
Yeah.
That's a connection that we need to make more clear.
Yeah, yeah. When I was in the West Bank a couple years ago before the war started, it's like this is right before even like a lot of the Stop Cop City stuff started popping up nationally with use of AI cameras. And it's like those same AI cameras are what, Palestinians have to go through in border checkpoints every day,
Mhm.
right? And that is the reality now with our urban settings now. It's like the same type of cameras that have been tested among Palestinian people are now being deployed to give us flock tickets. I've gotten so many flock tickets in Oakland just for the last couple of months. It
And
drives
then
me
can I
insane.
say another thing?
Go, of course, of course, of course.
And this is
We're
very,
talking.
yeah. Um, I'm sorry, I'm looking up that poor baby's name. Um, Cohen Wiley,
Mm,
the 1-year-old that was shot in
hmm
Mississippi.
hmm
No child should lose their life, especially at the hands of police, people who are supposedly supposed to maintain the public peace, right?
hmm
That precious baby's life is no more precious than the thousands and thousands of 1-year-olds that have lost their lives, who had their lives stolen in Palestine. Those all of our destinies are interlinked, right? Um, the loss of a child in Palestine is no less sad than the loss of a child here, just because they are not on our shores,
hmm
right?
Absolutely.
So I just I just really encourage people to internalize what feelings when you see stories like that, what do you feel inside in your heart? And then imagine what it's like for people across our shores. We're all human. We all have the same needs, and to see someone being treated how they don't deserve, I think the measure of our humanity is how we respond to people being treated how they don't deserve.
Absolutely.
And it's about being morally consistent. So if I do not want to see a child shot to death by our police here in the States, I don't want to see a child shot to death by the IOF slash IDF in Palestine or bombed to death by US bombs in Nigeria or starved by a US embargo in Cuba. All of all of these things are connected and every child's life is precious. And I just wish that our leaders would act accordingly.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And especially when you see them like all employing the same tactics. Yeah, I think it's so interesting, not interesting, but it's quite terrible. It's just that we all deal with the same basic culture of dehumanization,
Hmm.
right? Like I saw an interesting bit of analysis of like someone going through the news headlines being like, which one of these head news companies is going to call this 1-year-old a baby?
Hmm.
Right? Like, what is going to actually acknowledge not like, oh, this child was killed. No, it was a baby, right?
Hmm.
A baby, right? In the same way with
Exactly.
Palestine, right? Or with Iran, like they blow up 150 schoolgirls, but they don't call them children, right? They
Yes.
don't,
And that's exactly see, that's another connection, how Black children are robbed of their childhood. They are deemed adults.
Mhm.
Um, like Trayvon Martin, all those cases where children who have been murdered are deemed not children
Mhm.
by way of their race. And
Mhm.
it's the same in other parts of the world where the US is involved in imperial conquest. They
Yeah.
don't, children are not seen as children because their ethnicity is what people see first.
Mhm.
And this world is, this world doesn't deserve those children.
Yeah.
And it's just a shame that people don't see babies as human beings depending on where in the world they come from or depending on what hue their skin is.
Yeah.
So that is something that um yeah, that's just something that we hope to bring to the forefront and have people really reckon with and like really try to gauge like where are they in their thought process when they think about um minors and like how they see them and does is that consistent with who these children actually are?
Absolutely.
Children.
Absolutely, children. Right. And I think, I think the work of organizations like BAP, particularly the last couple of years, I do think just to, sort of transition and be more hopeful is that, like, we have actually moved the needle of public opinion in that the contradictions in this society are so high, right? Like everyone young people in particular do understand these basic contradictions in our society, right? They understand that the genocide on Palestine is wrong. They understand that the war in Iran is like, it's a false, it's a false issue, right? No one fears, especially, thinking of it, we're a society coming out of, the war on terror, right? Where, 70% of Americans initially supported the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan for no reason, no good reason. Right. And we see how like it's like we people are getting more educated. The education is working. It's that next step of how we get more organized, brought together in struggle is still the missing piece, or it's the developing piece. Again, let's be constructive here because we don't want to just look at the state of the world and think that nothing can happen. Otherwise, we wouldn't do demonstrations over at Levi Stadium, right? We wouldn't be here having this conversation. We're really trying to seize the time, going back to that Black Panther modus, which again comes out of revolutionary China, is we're trying to seize this time and actually use this opening, the work that our predecessors have done. And so, yeah, I just want to thank you for taking the time to speak to me today about this very important issue.
Thank you so much, Dayton, for inviting me on. I really appreciate your
Of
time.
course, of course, of course.
It's important to recognize that the World Cup represents so much more than just um, than just sports, than just soccer, than just international love of your team. It represents gentrification, it represents capital, it represents, surveillance, it represents imperialism, it
Hmm.
represents deportations. And this is what a lot of people are really trying to highlight with these protests. Like in Los Angeles in particular, once again, a lot of the protests that were being highlighted the most were around like the mixed politics of Iranians, which we've seen a lot in the past few months since the beginning of the war. With people who are pro Shah, people who are anti Shah, people who are like, we hate this administration and it needs a change, so the war is good. And then other people who are like, yeah, war is not great.
Hmm.
We don't want this war to happen, period. Um, and so that was what was getting most of the coverage. But there was some small opposition inside the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum where activists that are a part of the No Olympics LA group
Hmm. Hmm.
snuck banners inside a viewing area that read FIFA brings ice and red card for Empire displayed before being escorted out by security.
Hmm.
And I think this is really important too because the Olympics is another international sports body that really embodies a lot of these same principles. The No Olympics for LA group has really been pushing hard for a while now to try and prevent the Olympics from, going off without a hitch in Los Angeles and in California generally, because we see what happens year after year. Every time the Olympics happens, capital comes in. There's waves of gentrification. They build all these buildings. They kick all these people out, And then what ends up happening, it ends up being a shit show for a lot of people that live there and formerly lived there. We're left with all these empty buildings, all this, useless infrastructure. And for what? It's to help embolden, the interests of capital. Another example is in Seattle. This is kind of ridiculous. Police basically created these like tiny designated free speech areas where protests were deemed acceptable. These areas are, they weren't really that big. They would probably at most, like some of them were like 25 by 25 feet. The picture of them, it's actually pretty humorous, like how they thought they were going to be able to contain just like a handful of protesters in this area, a handful of protesters in that area, in voicing their opposition. And so, the protesters largely ignored this stuff. This is a extremely insulting measure, for free speech generally, for organizing. And, a lot of these people opted to take their demonstrations into the streets around Seattle Stadium, around Pioneer Square. And so I think it's important that people are doing stuff like this, showing resistance in areas where they're not allowed, showing resistance in areas when they're told they have to be on the sideline. This is happening all across the United States in major cities at varying levels. I just figured it'd be important to highlight a couple of these examples here on the West Coast. The small amount of opposition in the United States shouldn't really be that surprising. Many people likely saw the celebrations turned riots in New York that left one 17-year-old shot, 5 people stabbed or slashed, 5 school buses torched, and somewhat less tragically, 10 cops injured and 5 police cars damaged in the wake of the Knicks winning the finals in 5 games, the NBA finals. I know lots of people specifically credit this to being unique to the Knicks fan base in New York, but I think when we're talking about sports, all fan bases have pretty toxic individuals, and the more fans there are, the more reactionary stuff comes with it. And I think really what this is it's emblematic of United States sports culture. Not all sports fans across the world had the same type of culture. We see what football fans in Ireland are like, and in other parts of the UK, they show out for Palestine. They're very clear in their opposition of Israel. It's not the same as it is here at all. This is really a thing that's, I wouldn't say it's like necessarily only in the United States, but it's particularly notable in the United States. We see how sports is used more of a distraction from politics as opposed to like the reality that it's an intersection of where capital meets entertainment in order to, really obfuscate like the truth behind the matter. I saw a lot of reactions from people on social media that were criticizing the celebrations in New York in particular, kind of wondering what would happen if people brought the same energy to like an ICE detention facility. I wonder about that sometimes too, but maybe, in a better day, in a better time. However, things outside of the U.S. are much different. I talked about last Friday in the weekly news update that the opposition to the World Cup looked much different in Mexico and Mexico City. The protests in the country's capital led to the central Zocalo Square being locked down and protests being prohibited. But despite that, groups have been involved with the protests from all sorts of different industries, including transport workers, farmers, teachers, retired judges, public employees, missing persons collectives, health workers. These protests have been staged all across the city, with streets in some areas being lined with protest encampments in order to bring the city to a standstill. And this is just going to keep going, and I think this is the type of opposition that, I think we would love to see in the United States, generally, when we're talking about these international sports events, but also just generally, And a big part of it is they're really trying to underline the fact that the budget that's being used for, these international sports events, in particular the World Cup, if you compare that to the amount that like teachers make with their pensions and stuff, it's so much larger. It's pretty ridiculous. But yeah, I figured it'd be good to talk about this because a lot of people are just focusing on the sports aspect of these things. But there's so much more to this than just like the matches and the countries and the people involved. But yeah, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this stuff.
Of course. Yeah, as I see it, like, often sports culture is like dominantly just about dividing the working class,
Mm-hmm.
right? You see how like all these different inter-imperialist competition, how that plays out within sports, right? Like, there's the prohibitions on the Iranian team, right? Where they were able to uh they had a draw in their match. I forgot who they're competing against, and they're like immediately ejected from the country, right? Like given like negative treatment because not because of anything the team did, but because of the relationship between the Iranian government and the United States government, right? That wouldn't happen if the World Cup was based in almost any other country,
Mm-hmm.
right? Then you think of like the prohibitions on, say, the Haitian team's uniforms because they're considered too political. Which is ridiculous. It's like it's based on their national flag, which is the first black republic in the New World, right? Like their origin is highly political, as are most countries' origins, right? But again, it's the oppression that's faced upon a country of black people in the Caribbean, right? And I think and the same thing with like the later Olympics. Like these are all basically ways to divide the working class, because if I see it, we talk about stuff's going on in the Knicks. It's like literally every sports franchise in this country is like that. It could be hockey, it could be basketball, it could be football. I mean, obviously, if these are sports that have a working class appearance, right? Like a working class base, then there's this associated like violence and destruction associated with their celebrations because no one has ever flipped over a cop car due to a tennis match or a few rounds of golf, right? Tiger Woods has never caused a riot. And that, goes back to the fact that like, the base is not that base of those sports are not for the working class. They're for well-to-do
Mm-hmm.
people. So their fans just get drunk and beat their spouses at home, which is also another big aspect of sports culture, right? That I was looking into that apparently internationally, that's a thing around the world where when teams after championships, domestic violence goes up in households, right? So we see exactly how like sports culture as a team, as a tool to divide the working class in their
Mm-hmm.
homes, between nations, in individual communities, like on the street, attacking each other over what jersey you wear. It's, it's ridiculous. And it's very much, supported by the superstructure of our country.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, you bring up some good points there about just like the nature of like patriarchy internationally and like rape culture generally, and the role that like this toxic form of masculinity plays in intersecting with when we're talking about capital and its interests and how people relate to sports and stuff. But there's certainly other ways to relate to sports than just this, the main ways that it's presented. I mean, I often think about like with yeah, like when reading about like the sharecroppers in particular in the deep south during the depression era, a lot of them, even though they were organizing, they also loved to play baseball. I think like a lot about, yeah, just like internationally there's lots of different examples of sports being a unifier rather than a divider. But we see largely how sports cultures is promoted and portrayed in our modern day is one that's representing the ruling class as opposed to something that can be used as a way to unite it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, well, want to talk about the war?
Sure, why not?
Awesome. So there's a tentative Iran deal. I think folks may have hopefully folks have been paying attention to the current U.S. and Israel's war on Iran, mostly because I'm sick and tired of paying over $6 at the pump this entire time, right?
Pretty bad.
Yeah, it's terrible, right? And so this whole situation has been basically a disaster for the Trump administration, U.S. interests in the Middle East. And so this recent deal is like a major setback in a lot of ways for the war hawks in our government, right? Because I think the initial war, set off this, energy war, right? Where the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, Iranian attacks on U.S. and its allied Arab nations' oil and petroleum infrastructure and military bases has really kind of crippled shipping going through that area and has really led to spikes in energy prices that have been passed on to working people around the world. And so, Trump began this war at the behest of Israel, with the idea that it was going to be short and overwhelmingly successful. And so, despite all the civilian death toll of the Iranian people and, different service members of the U.S. Armed Forces that were injured in different Iranian missile attacks, overall, the U.S.'s interests have not been met. And when I say
Mm-hmm.
interests not be met, I'm really referring to the actual war hawks, right? Because the war hawks are really hoping that this war would be it. This would be the war where they can actually instigate a ground conflict, where they can foment some kind of fracture in the Iranian state to exploit it, and basically roll the whole thing up. And they were largely unsuccessful. They're also largely unsuccessful from pushing, even with this current deal, pushing Iranians back from the political precedent set by previous nuclear deals, right? And so I think for one particular area, there's all these different efforts to basically expand the war that were basically denied. Because it was going so poorly. I think there was a recent attempt by the U.S. U.S. Attempted or planned to enter Iran to seize uranium resources, to assassinate leaders, to establish a foothold. And because the missile exchanges have been so unsuccessful, they've been largely unable to launch that. I think just last week, Trump called off a planned ground operation to seize Iranian uranium. Excuse me, difficult phrase to put out of
Yeah,
my mouth.
it's a
And
tongue
ultimately,
twister.
they had to back down on it, right? And so they've had to extend this ceasefire numerous times after Trump said they were never going to extend the new initial ceasefire. They've had to backtrack on attempts to escalate the different bombing campaigns. And even then, Israel has used this as an opportunity to expand its own interests, right? Not just launching missiles onto Iran, but also launching missiles and sending troops into southern Lebanon to occupy southern Lebanon. It's the Iran has also responded to that and fired missiles upon Israel because they see Israeli aggression into southern Lebanon as like also an extension of the same war with Iran.
Mm-hmm.
And so, overall, the U.S. has been overwhelmingly unsuccessful in this war. And so, just this week, they haven't reached a tentative agreement, but there's a tentative agreement on the table that's to be signed in Switzerland this coming week, which basically calls for the opening of the Strait of Hormuz, the unfreezing of a lot of different Iranian assets that were frozen once the war started. They were held internationally. And third, a promise by the Iranian government that they're not going to create a nuclear weapon, which is something they've already promised to do in previous rounds of negotiation. And so there's 11 other points to this agreement that hasn't been signed, and those largely haven't been released to my knowledge. And so we can have another in our next weekly update. We'll have some updates if that deal goes through. This deal could ultimately not go through because I think one of the stipulations that Iran has put on the U.S. is that Israel has to back down in Lebanon. They have to back down the missile strikes. They have to back down the occupation of the South. And so we've seen historically that Israel's not going to do that, right? And so the real question is if that actual sticking point is going to actually force the war to extend, right? Which again has been a lot of egg on the face of the Trump administration. So yeah, the war has been an absolute failure for the United States. It has been a great cost toward the Iranian people. And overall, it has been unsuccessful in dislodging them and advancing U.S. interests in the area.
Yeah, definitely. It's a complete and utter shit show on a number of fronts. I mean, I think I've definitely talked about in some news updates how, like, Israel hasn't backed down from taking land in Lebanon, how they're using this as a way to push even further into Gaza, take more territory there, despite the fact it is in clear violation of a lot of agreements that have been made. And it's definitely frustrating Trump and other members of the government, all of them probably not showing it a whole lot. I think it was pretty interesting too. Like a couple weeks ago, there was this whole thing about like both the armed forces in Israel and the United States becoming integrated with one another. That's a pretty unprecedented thing that I don't think has ever really happened.
Yeah.
Honestly, I'm definitely going to look into that after this, but it's extremely significant, and I think it's really telling because, the U.S. was essentially dragged into this war and now they're being forced to, basically buddy up with this other, armed forces that's, trying to really push this despite the fact that it has been extremely unsuccessful. It's a thing that we've always known is going to be unsuccessful, for decades. And yet, despite that, this is just another thing another blemish on the present Trump administration of like things they just can't seem to do well because they're really good at that. If nothing
Real
else,
good. Real good at that.
Yeah.
All right, want to talk about Elon?
Yeah, sure. So for our last piece of news, we're just gonna chat a little bit about something that happened this past week. After the recent IPO of SpaceX going public, essentially the company became valued around $2 trillion.
Yuck.
And that made Elon Musk the world's first ever trillionaire.
Boo.
Couldn't have picked a lamer person to become a trillionaire. I mean, seriously, the dude is not even a gamer.
Yeah, he's got
What a shame.
He's got a fake penis.
He's
It's a cis man
got
with
a
a fake wiener.
He's got fake hair. He's got a fake dick. He fakes his gameplay
No
on his
offense to
streams.
people with fake penises.
He can't even hire. He can't even hire people to mod his chat. What a loser!
What a fucking loser! Like,
I mean, come on.
Like a single
He's
father
got $1
of
trillion
13 children.
and he can't hire
Yuck.
people to moderate his chat.
13 children out of wedlock. Disgusting.
Yeah.
Mostly through surrogate.
But yeah, this company is valued at around $2 trillion, even though they've only had like a 60% success rate with their rocket launches. Some of them have gone well, a number of them haven't. And it's also worth noting that SpaceX is a pretty dangerous company to work for. In 2023, it was reported that there are over 600 previously unreported workplace injuries. I wouldn't be surprised if this number has only gone up since we saw that Elon was heading Doge for a bit until the president eventually was like, I'm sick of you. I can't deal with you anymore. And I think a large reason why he was doing that was to cut down on government oversight of the various corporations that he runs, because if anything, Elon Musk is good at anything. He's really good at treating his workers terribly. He's really good at OSHA violations. He's really good at trying to tout ideas like they're his and getting credit for things that he didn't come up with,
He's a very good union buster.
Yeah, he's a very good union buster. The only thing in recent memory that I could think he probably is like actually genuinely like created other than an idea is probably the Cybertruck, and we all know how they look. It's one of the probably the ugliest car ever created. Also one of the most useless ones given all the things it was touted to do.
Yeah, like driven by like problematic dads and like violent young men all over the West Coast. It's crazy.
Yeah, as if seeing Teslas everywhere wasn't a warning sign. Seeing a Cybertruck is like double that, It's like you could exponentially raise that. Yeah, that's how I feel generally seeing them on the street.
It's like the PT Loser on steroids. Remember PT Loser?
The PT Cruiser?
No, the PT Loser. That's what we called it as children. Like we are.
Even that's aged better.
It is aged better. Like now it's fun. Like I would love to drive around a PT Loser. I'm not using the real name, but like this is like it takes it to another like an extreme. It's just like it looks like every like stereotypical future car. Like it literally looks like a bastardized versions of the car from Minority Report. Remember those shits?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anywho.
Yeah. I mean, we talked about, we mentioned that Elon's really good at union busting, as are most, billionaires, as are most the single trillionaire now. Its disregard for workplace safety practices is also really well documented. There was a report that came out in 2023, I want to say, where there were 1,100 different accidents that went unreported at various Tesla plants. Tesla has been fined hundreds of thousands of dollars for said injuries, accidents, and violations of OSHA standards. But this is like, I don't even think it qualifies as a slap on the wrist,
Yeah.
When we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars, even if it was like $1 million across all of his companies, $1 million against $1 trillion.
It's nothing.
It's 100,000 million.
100,000 million.
100,000 million. That's nothing, No, that's more than that. I don't know. I'm bad at math.
100,000
I went to
a
a charter school, so don't.
Oh, his well. Well, it just goes back to like I think Lenin talks about that, how like basically if like the legal penalty is a fine, then what it means is just that poor people can't do this and rich people can, right? Like if the penalty for like breaking a law is just a fine, it just means it's just like it's just there's an income level that you need to have in order to do whatever that thing is, right? So you have to be a big corporation before you can like injure 600 of your workers, right? And once you can, you're like go crazy, you know?
Yeah, it's pretty gross, you know. I mean, I think yeah, I see stuff like this and it's like pretty demoralizing, but I think it's really a sign that like workers in these different companies really need to push and organize more. And I think there
They
just
can afford it.
there needs to be a new wave, you know, of union organizing in this country that's able to push things forward like it did in the early 20th century, you know. I mean, are we really going to have another Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in order for there to start being like actual like investigations into this stuff? I will say under this present administration, we're not going to even see an investigation. We're just going to see a lot of BS about fake news and this and that and whatever.
And
But
hopefully more warehouse fires.
yeah, I mean, yeah, you know, there's warehouse fires and there's warehouse fires. You know,
Exactly.
warehouses sometimes just catch on fire. Other times, people are mad.
People are mad
So,
that they make nothing
yeah.
working all day in the warehouse.
I think the Tracy warehouse fire was just a warehouse fire.
Yeah.
But it happens, and it's crazy that it did happen because that was a. Yeah, I think one report described it as like literally just like a skyscraper on its side on fire. It
Yeah.
was huge.
Massive facility.
I'm surprised we didn't get worse air quality in the Bay Area and generally, but it probably just had to do with like the winds and stuff. And
Oh
how
yeah,
things
it's
were blowing.
that became a Central California problem.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think you know we might see. I mean, we're hopefully going to see more union organizing over the years. We might see a move back to the you know the Luddite movement where people are just like these machines suck.
Anti-tech.
Let's just destroy it. You know, I mean that might be more of what we need in the
Yeah,
future. 'Cause at this point, it's you know I don't want to say anything's better than nothing, but certainly something's better than
Something
nothing.
must be done. Is
Something
really,
must
really,
be
right?
done.
Because I think it goes back to like, what does it mean that the company's valued at $2 trillion? What does it mean that Elon Musk is valued at 2 trillion, at what, 1.3, 1.6 trillion or
Something like
something?
that, yeah.
Right. So it's like, you know, in the end, like this is just like basically a title. It shows like the real consolidation and expectation for these companies, right? Like it's a valuation, which is again, like it's all built on sand. It's built on speculation. And so this idea that he has this much wealth is like, it's largely like this big con game, right? It speaks to how terrible these people are at whatever business is they do, like right, like they use this monopoly position. And I think you know you're right, Dale, to bring up the whole early 20th century because you know at that point, you know, unions are union organizers working in a situation of trustified industries, right? Like in that you know these companies were like either vertically or horizontally monopolized, right? Where like
Or
these
both at
or
the
both,
same
both at the
time.
same time with things, right? And so you know that was a big thing, like that prevented unions from even getting their foot in the door. And so you know, obviously, we live in the era of the oligopolies, right? Where we have three different types of the same product made by three different corporations that all just share the profits, right? And so, you know, there's still the same basic contradiction exists. And, you know, we've lived in a time, there's been a time where it was common practice for the bosses just to shoot the workers when they organized. Now, that would still make the news in a way that it didn't back in those days. And so, you know, the future, the conditions are ripe. But the question is, are folks going to get organized to do that? And I think they can. They think they will. It's going to happen small levels, but it has to happen because if not, these people are just going to speculate and raise their wealth even higher, and then leave us with nothing, nothing.
Yeah, I think that's a good point you bring about the speculative wealth. You know, I think some reports that I saw is like even though this is being valued at like a $2 trillion so far, it's sold like $70 billion. That's still a small fraction of it. And who's to say he doesn't try and just sell all his shares when he feel like he can make the most out of it? That's gonna cause a huge lot of waves and stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's you know, we know who people like Elon and Jeff Bezos and such are, and it's important that you know we try and look at stuff that's happened in the past and it's like, okay, like some of this stuff may not exist anymore, but we can still build off of the lessons and really try to move things forward. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
All right, so that's a good hopeful note. We want to leave things on a hopeful note. That the conditions are bright, even if like the world is run by psychopaths that all spent time on the island, and the richest man in the world was considered too weird to be invited to Epstein's island. So just think about that.
It's emailing at 2 a.m.
Yeah,
It's like, Jeff, what's the party? It's like, we're just leaving.
It's like and then he goes and emails Ghislaine Maxwell being like, block this man. Make it go away. Make it disappear. Hilarious. All right. Well, on that note, I think we're prepared to close out. So,
Yeah.
thank you so much for this another episode 9 of The Rising Tide.
Yep.
Remember, like and subscribe on whatever platform you find this at. Any questions or comments or criticisms are always welcome. Leave it on the down in the comment section. We've got our last minute guests trying to say goodbye to the audience member, folks. Hell yeah. All right, y'all.
All right. Until next time, appreciate all the support, all the feedback, all the comments, all the such and such. And yeah, see you on the flip side.
See you in the flip, gang.